Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Danny and today is the third episode of Fantasy Genre Blends. If you guys have never watched one of the previous episodes, essentially what I am doing is trying to figure out different fantasy blends that I enjoy. So fantasy horror, fantasy thrillers, fantasy mysteries, and so on and so forth. Because I really enjoy fantasy in general, and so trying to pull in those different genres to give myself a little bit of a way into beginning some different journeys in my reading path and figure out what I like. So as always, we're going to start with the 3 books that were on my TBR for this episode, and the first of those is The Daughter of Dr. Moreau. This was a fantasy / historical fiction, and if you guys have read The Island of Dr. Moreau in the past, it is kind of going off of that story, but instead of following Dr. Moreau, we follow his daughter. And so you still have it's not an island aspect because I believe that it's set in Mexico, but there is still an isolation of the compound that they're at, his experiments where he is trying to figure out how to create human-like animals, and his daughter, and how kind of she has to live with this process and being isolated in this really beautiful place, and kind of how she lives. Most of the books that I pick up that do kind of reference the Island of Dr. Moreau always focus on the things that I don't want them to focus on. We spent a lot of time in the day-to-day life with, I think her name was Carlotta. I read this book a while back, so forgive me if my memory is a little off. I'm pretty sure it's Carlotta, and we spent a lot of time with her day-to-day, what she does and what she likes. It's very slice of life, and what I want from a story about the Island of Dr. Moreau is I want to live with the hybrids. I want to know what their everyday life is. I want to know what their aches and pains are. I want to know how they're thinking and how they're feeling. And we get a small dose of that in this book, which is the part I really did enjoy, when you get to see her interactions with them, and then there is something that happens towards the end of the book where you get to see the hybrids interact with each other and with other people, which I really enjoyed. But that was such a small part of the book. I just think that there was an opportunity missed here. I also think that maybe, I've read a couple of Gothic books recently, I'll talk about one in just a minute, that I have not had good luck with. I recently read What Moves the Dead, and then this book I think has Gothic tendencies, and then Juniper and Thorn, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. I think maybe Gothic stories just aren't for me. I'm not going to give up on them just yet, but I haven't had I haven't had a good time with any of the Gothic stories that I've read so far. Although, I guess it's not true, because I think Catherine House is also a little bit of a Gothic tale, and I loved that book. So, like I said, I'm not going to give up on it, but it's something that I've just been keeping on my radar. The next book was a super big letdown for me, and that is Juniper and Thorn. And this book follows Marlon Chen, who is a witch who has 2 sisters who live in the house of their father, who is a wizard. And the book starts out so good. If you have ever watched The Addams Family or grew up with that like I did, this book felt like that in the beginning. And I was thinking, oh, this is gonna be a 5-star read. It's so good. And then it just made a turn. So you follow Marlon Chen and her 3 sisters who are working for their community. So one of them can make like healing potions, one of them can see the future, and Marlon Chen can see memories. And so you kind of get to live through some of those components with them. You also get to talk about their history and the fact that they talk about how like certain things happen in fairy tales. She talks about mothers. So her mother is not there anymore. Something specific happens to her, and I'm not going to give spoilers, but she talks about how in fairy tales mothers are either dead or they're wicked. And so it constantly compares the stuff that happens in their day-to-day life to common fairy tale stories, which I really enjoyed. You also get to learn that they're living in this house with their father, who is kind of a crazed and mean wizard who can manipulate
and transmorph things into other things. And so, for instance, at one point in the book, he changes the gate into snakes, and so that's one of his powers. He's also known to be very powerful. And they live in this house full of all these monsters. And so you have the spiny-backed monster that lives underneath her bed, that they have to kind of make sure that, corral it and make sure that it's peaceful throughout the day. They have another one who thinks that he's a god. They have all these different things that live in their household with them. And it was just really cool to learn about their life. And then one night the sisters and her leave to go and do something. And the book just went downhill from there. It started going into insta-love, and it just focused on a relationship I really didn't understand. It also it just stopped focusing on the world. So it stopped focusing on the world and the differences between like the normal world and this magical world that they were living in. And it started focusing on just some negative aspects of life. It went into Marlinchen's want to be free and independent, which I think was a good part of the story. Like that's a good thing to want to have your plot be surrounding, but I just think it was done in the wrong way. And I don't know, once again, if that's the gothic feel of this story, because it was, at first I thought, this is really whimsical, I like how this is going, and then it just kind of got dark and dim and there was no light. And once again, because of the gothic feel of the story, I don't know if that's why. I did read a review on this that I think kind of spelled it out really well, was the fact that in Gothic books and that type of theme, they will try and pair things together, really intense emotions that don't necessarily always connect. So things like love and intense pain, or things like that, where you have opposite emotions, or emotions that you wouldn't tie together that they then try to tie together in the storyline. And I do think that happens in this book, and it just didn't jive with me. So I rated this a 2-star. It was really disappointing. I loved the first part of the book, but well, you can't win them all. The last book from my TBR from the last video was Magic for Liars, and this book I rated 3 stars. So this book follows the murder of someone at a magical school. The person that they bring in to solve this murder is a person who does not have magic. And so typically speaking, in the world that they've built in this book, people who have magic and people who don't have magic don't really mesh. They are very separate from the world, and they specifically have magic schools for people who have magic, and people who don't have magic are typically not allowed. And so the reason that this person is allowed to come in and investigate is because she is the sister of one of the professors, and you follow her story about her figuring out this murder. So this is a fantasy mystery, and there was definitely a mystery. Obviously someone is murdered and you don't know why, and you are following the investigation through the entire thing, but I was just kind of bored the entire time. There wasn't anything that was super suspenseful. There were some really cool aspects that were mentioned. There's some prophecies that are mentioned. There are these really strange powers, like theoretical magic, that her sister, I guess, is an expert in, that they kind of go into, but they didn't dive into it enough. And I think that the separation of the fact that this investigator is not involved in this world, I think I liked that aspect, where she's trying to learn about the magic that she's never been a part of and how that has affected her in her life. I liked that aspect, but as far as the mystery goes, I didn't really care. It wasn't something that I was actively engaged in trying to figure out. And so that part kind of felt lost in the book to me. So it wasn't a bad book, wasn't an excellent book, so I rated it a 3 stars. 3 more books that I'm just going to mention that I have read that do fit into this mold. So this was not in my last video as my TBR, but just books that I've come across that do fit into the fantasy genre blends that I just want to give a shout out. So one of them is The Book Eaters, which I recently talked about in my wrap up, and then also in the Horror for Beginners that I posted.
And this book, I rated a 4-star. I thought it was a really fun read. It's definitely a horror book that I would recommend for people who haven't read horror before. It was really engaging. The world was fascinating to live in. I'm not going to talk a lot about it because I know I've talked about it in the past 2 videos, but it's a really good book, and if you haven't checked it out yet, I would recommend it. The next book, not so much. I had another fantasy horror book that I checked out called The Changeling that I did not enjoy at all. I DNF'd it. I think I was pretty far along in the book. I don't remember the percentage. I'd have to go back and look at the video, but I was pretty far along before there even was anything magical going on in the book, and I just got frustrated. It was very dry, and I couldn't read it anymore. So wasn't for me. So fantasy horror this month has not been super engaging for me. I'm still on the lookout, but I think I'm going to take a break for the next couple months on fantasy horror just to kind of maybe reset before I look at some other options. The last one that I'll mention that I did read within the last couple months is Follow Me to Ground. This is another one that I tried, and once again I DNF'd it. This one I might pick up again. I think maybe I just wasn't in the right headspace. It was definitely creepy. I liked the vibe of the book, and it's very short. I just had a lot going on in October, and I was confused by some of the writing choices and wasn't following along with the book as much as I thought I should be, and so I put it down. But I think that the vibes of the book definitely were really cool. The writing style, there was something about it that I wasn't meshing with. So it might be something I pick up later on, another fantasy horror, so maybe I'll leave that for a later fantasy genre blend episode. Now on to the future TBR for the next episode. So I am planning on reading 3 books once again for the next episode. One of them is fantasy historical fiction, one is fantasy mystery, and the other is fantasy romance, I believe. The first book on my TBR for the next episode is The Invisible Library. This book was recommended to me by BookTube with Amy, and the synopsis just sounds right up my alley. It obviously involves books. It's a library. It's a mysterious library that apparently, they says, harvests books from other realities, and it involves a spy, and I'm sure that a mystery is going to ensue, and I am really excited to get to this one. The next book on my TBR is a historical fiction / fantasy, and that is The Diviners. So I've just heard a lot about this, and it's definitely a series I haven't picked up. I don't know a lot about it other than I think it's set in the 1920s, and it is about a girl who goes to live with, I think, an uncle that maybe has some mysterious things going on. It sounds fascinating, so I'm excited to give it a read as well. And the last on my list is Belladonna. So this is a fantasy / romance / mystery. I don't know a lot about it. I've just heard a lot of people on BookTube talk about it, and so I decided to pick it up. So that is my TBR for my fantasy genre blends. If you guys have any recommendations for me that you would like me to look at, please put them in the comments below. I am always looking for recommendations for this particular series. I think that these books are a lot of fun, and kind of following this journey, trying to figure out which of the fantasy genre blends that I enjoy the most has been really fun, and I appreciate any recommendations that you can give. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you have a good evening. I'll see you next time.